Here we are talking about Chapter 27, so the Islamic, or also known as the Gunpowder Empires, that existed between 1450 and about 1750 for our time period. This concludes kind of that second section of, the course where we're looking at land-based and maritime-based empires, which, if we're looking at, in context of the AP World curriculum, that's, units 3 and 4. So we're about halfway through everything we're looking at now through this part. All right, so, and to understand the Islamic gunpowder empires, we have our three empires actually here on the map. So we have the Mughal Empire that is located here in northern India, into what would now be also Pakistan, Bangladesh, and a little bit into Afghanistan, and then they'll also move into the southern part of India as well. We have the Safavid Empire, predominantly located in what is now known as Iran, and then part of the Caucasus, and then a few of the other located now, like Turkmenistan, that would be kind of located to the north, and a few other locations. And then we also have the massive Ottoman Empire that dominates much of the eastern Mediterranean and much of what we consider to be the Middle East, with the exception of a lot of the Arabian Peninsula. All right, so we're going to kind of look at these as in general, but also look at these in the sense of taking it, empire by empire. So it'll take about, this video and maybe one or two others to kind of go over all of the important stuff within the gunpowder or Islamic gunpowder empires. All right, and so some of the similarities between all three empires is that they grow out of the fall or the downfall of the Mongol Khanate. So if we go back, talking about the Mongol expansion, so remember that the Mongols, come out of Mongolia into China and then essentially make it almost all the way into Syria. And then they're kind of stopped in this area here. But there was also a number that made it into Europe with, the Khan of the Golden Horde that made it, and took, tributes out of Russia. So they kind of, once the Khanates fall apart, I should say the four Khanates that fall apart, leave sort of a power vacuum. And the book mentioned, and we kind of skipped over it in context for this year, talking about Tamerlan, also known as Timur, who was again another Mongol Turkic nomadic warrior who tried to establish this massive empire in the same area that again fell apart. And so many of the early emperors of these three, empires themselves took and had connections to, most likely Turkic nomads and warriors, but they also claimed to have, actual blood connection or relation to Tamerlan and also some of the Mongol warriors themselves to sort of solidify their expansion and the reasons behind that. All right, and they're aided heavily by the use of gunpowder and cannons. So guns and cannons are a very large part of their successes in terms of how they're able to conquer land as a result. All right, that we're also talking about how that actually hinders them later on because of their access to weapons and how they actually got said weapons. All right. So yeah, then we also mentioned that connection to their Turkic-Mongol history and that claim to those people. Okay. All are Muslim leaders, all right, but some occupy different religious peoples. In fact, they're all fairly, with the exception of the Safavid Empire, the Ottomans and the Mughals are fairly diverse places. And not that the Safavids don't have some diversity in them, but again, you have various different religious groups that exist among them with different levels of religious toleration and gender relations that exist inside all three different empires. Again, we'll take those kind of stage by stage here, all right. They occupy a lot of the old Silk Road routes, okay? But there's also a strong connection to the Indian Ocean trade down here, as we can see with the Mughals, a little bit of the Safavids, and the connection with the Ottomans to the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, but also with the location of the Ottomans having very strong connections to the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. So while they have a lot of that land connection over the Silk Roads, they also have maritime connections as well, and we'll see how that lays in here as Europe begins to expand into these territories in the 15 and 1600s. All right, all of them promote public works, so the rebuilding of canals and roads and bridges, but they also emphasize, religious and a little bit of secular education. Predominantly, though, we're focusing on the religious education pieces we'll see. But they also use patronage. So again, supporting artists, scholars, religious works, and things of that nature, hence where we get, here's the Hagia Sophia here within what is now Istanbul, which was the former Byzantine Empire of Constantinople. That used to be a Byzantine church and is now a Muslim mosque. And we also have the Taj Mahal down here in the Mughal Empire, located in northern India. So they all use that to enhance their power, their standing, their prestige, and to again embolden, the feelings of religion, and also to show off what they are capable of doing. Even though the Taj Mahal itself is not actually a religious building, as we'll see, it is a pretty much the most expensive funeral home you'll ever see, or the most expensive burial site ever seen. Okay, so yeah, we'll take our first look here at the Ottoman Empire. Okay, so the Ottoman Empire is the largest of the empires, at least at its largest extent. All right. You can kind of see here by this map, this is the areas that were added to the Ottoman Empire over time. And it was also, one of the things to really point out, in terms of a dynasty, is probably the longest actual, continual lineage of one family ruling over one territory for a long time. Because I think, based on the sources I've seen, it's like the late 1280s through 1923, 1924. So for one family to have consistent power and ruling over, any one territory or empire lasts longer than any continual monarchy that I can think of, definitely longer than any of the actual China dynasties. And so I think that's really, really powerful. So the Ottomans start off over here as a Turkic group, kind of in this little spot where you kind of see it. That's around 1300 where they were. And then they expanded slowly out, and you kind of see, territory by territory, adding in parts of what was the Byzantine Empire. So they come out of that vacuum that was the Byzantines, or during the collapse of the Byzantines, but also, with the fall of, the Abbasid Caliphate, and the invasions of the Mongols. And so they kind of rose out of the ashes of that to sort of take up the mantle of, the dominant Muslim group in the area. And you can kind of see that they had a very large expanse into and holding on to much of the Balkans, so the Balkan region of Europe, all the way up almost to Vienna. They actually tried to besiege Vienna twice. So Budapest was actually under their control, parts of Romania, a large part, almost the entirety of the Black Sea for a time, including Crimea and parts of what would now be Ukraine, parts of Georgia, going into, again, Iraq, into, for a time, again, Egypt, all the way to Morocco and Algeria, and then also having Mecca and Medina. So at one point, they kind of had all three of the three holiest Muslim locations on the planet under their control. All right. So, I don't know why it keeps doing that. So, as we said, one of the oldest dynasties. So they viewed themselves in terms of known as what's the Ghazi, so religious or Islamic religious warriors, and consider themselves to be kind of, again, the arm of Islam to expand into, these territories to protect and promote the religion, as we've sort of seen with the other caliphates that we've kind of talked about, that the military is to spread the religion, and then the actual, Sufis and other missionaries will then promote the religion from within. All right, and because of their geography, and as we've said, you can think about why are they considered the defenders of the faith? Well, what is under their what parts of Islam are under their possession? All right, so conquering the former Byzantine Empire, taking Istanbul in 1453, which is at that point like the last standing piece of the Byzantine Empire at that point. So you can kind of see the acquisition. So they actually had conquered the areas surrounding Istanbul well before, or much of the Balkans well before they had actually conquered Istanbul, and then they besieged it in the early 1450s, and then added, these areas in purple around the same time, and then continued to spread out from that point. All right, so they became, as a result of that, the chief Islamic opponent of Europe, especially in this part of the Mediterranean, because the Safavids and the Mughals were, much, much further east, and that Europeans didn't have direct contact. This is right on their borders. It's close to Rome. It's close to Germany and Russia. Very close to Spain again, and Spain had just kind of gone through Al-Andalus and done the Reconquista around this time period, or right before this time period. So hence why it becomes, the chief enemy of Europe. And that includes not just in the military, but also in the trade, because now Silk Road trade goes right through, at the very end now, through, the Ottoman Empire. All right. So it becomes a center, not the center, but a center for trade and scholarship. Again, the rebuilding of Constantinople, which they then renamed Istanbul, because they had actually destroyed much of the city during the siege. as a result. And then they actually rebuilt it fairly well and pretty quickly and became the center of the Ottoman Empire and the capital. So the sultans or emperors have little real power. So similar to, where we talk about, Japan and the shogun having the real power, the viziers are the ones who sort of wield the administrative bureaucracy within the Ottoman Empire. And so the book does mention that early on, Ottoman Empire emperors and sultans actually had a lot of power, had sort of direct control. They were military leaders. But over time, out of issues of succession and fear, they essentially then began to keep, the sultans in training and their, brothers and other potential heirs sort of like hidden in the palace, and they never really left and got actual administrative experience. And this kind of happened again over time, like in the 15, 16, and 1700s, and then going a little bit beyond then. So the true strength of the Ottoman Empire falls under, the viziers or advisors. Hence why I use Jafar here, because for those of you that have seen Aladdin, and I know that's kind of like a stereotype, like why am I using Disney? And the only reason I do that is because when you think Grand Vizier, that fits under what Jafar was in the Aladdin franchise. Now, mind you, he's kind of like a backstabber. No spoiler there, hopefully, because he's out for his own power. But essentially, he's the one running the show and not the Sultan. So hence why I think that actually fits pretty well for the understanding of, what is the job of the viziers. Okay, so here's like them at their greatest extent. That's 1683. They last for another 250-ish years through the end of World War I. And so they're slowly going to lose over time to both Europeans, but other Muslim groups as well, including sort of a magistrate or an Islamic rule here within Egypt and, a few other locations as well. And that's going to be a result of overextended territory. You can just, again, think about the Roman Empire being way too big, or the Mongol Empire or Khanates being way too big. Not enough good communication for the time period because of the lack of technology at the time. And then, mismanaged and, lower level bureaucrats, overtaxing the people, and cause, more internal strife while also, facing off against, Europe. And we'll expand upon that as well. All right. So the treatment of non-Muslims in the Ottoman Empire. So they're a very diverse population, again, because if you think about this, you have Jewish people that exist within a lot of this territory, again, as Jews were kicked out of Al-Andalus. But then you also have Catholics and Byzantines living here in the Balkans, and then, other Christians that live within Jerusalem, within, Coptic Christians in this part of the world, too. So it's a very diverse population that lives there, obviously, Muslims being the majority. And also you have different ethnicities, too. So mostly they follow along the lines within the Ottoman Empire of protecting the rights of the people of the book. So continuing on with the millet system and the jizya tax on non-Muslims living under their territory. They also allow for many of them to be in the government and can earn elite status as being merchants or bureaucrats within there. However, there's also what we call the Devshirm, which is essentially the Balkan region has to give, essentially in tribute, Christian boys to go serve the Ottoman state as slaves. Most of them end up becoming Janissary soldiers, kind of shown in here, while others will actually serve in the bureaucracy. Okay, most of them are forced to convert. Not most. They are forced to convert to Islam, and so mind you, again, here's our Balkan territory as they expand, and so that's kind of the one spot where this doesn't work. Okay, the Janissaries themselves, because of the use of the military training, they end up becoming, essentially the main arm of the Ottoman military because they were very well trained from a young age. They have the guns, and so they end up becoming essentially the main part of the army that replaces sort of that nomadic cavalry, the aristocracy that had kind of existed in the early parts of the Ottoman Empire and expansion, and then they replaced them. But because of their power, they have the ability to sort of overthrow or choose the sultans during disputes over, who should be in charge. And they also hold back the military because that would, in terms of adding in new technology or new innovations, because that would limit their power. So they're actually one of the reasons for why they're a feared warrior group, but it also limits the expansion of the military because that would then hurt their capabilities and their knowledge. Okay. Foreign merchants are treated pretty well, and so these are merchants, not people living there. So again, the French and the British, because they could use that against, the Portuguese and the Italians, so Venetians. But they're also hurt by the Portuguese and the Indian Ocean trade because, okay, if we go back to the map here, that trade's going on over here, and they're not using their middlemen along the Silk Roads. So that's our little talk here on the Ottoman Empire and introduction to the other empires as well.